Ken Druck is one of the nation's pioneers in personal transformation, breaking fresh ground in male psychology, executive coaching, organizational coaching, parent effectiveness, healing after loss, and most recently, the art of turning adversity into opportunity. His company, Druck Enterprises, is a leading coaching, consulting, and team building firm with a broad base of clients, including Microsoft, Pfizer, IBM, and the YMCA. He's been touching lives for the past 35 years through his books, including The Secrets Men Keep, How to Talk to Your Kids, and Healing Your Life After the Loss of a Loved Ones. Ken is really, when I asked him what's the most important thing to know about you, he said, the real thing that I do in life is I go into the front lines and I help people turn their pain into love. And I love that I know that he has done this in his own life. He speaks from the total real deal experience. And we are all so delighted to have you here. He was the founder of the Jenna Druck Foundation, which produces award-winning programs to honor the life and the spirit of his daughter, Jenna. So let's all give Ken a wonderful TLC welcome. Yay, Ken. Woo!
Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you. Hey, what's it like to come on after such an extraordinary... I'm sitting here going, I need to rewrite my speech. All right. Did you ever? What are my 3 did you evers? But what I'm going to do, first of all, thank you so much. And I want to glean as much from that. What a powerful presentation. I want to share with you in the little time we have a few minutes of my journey. And I want to start by really asking you a question. How many of you know somebody, or you yourself, have stood in the ashes of Plan A, where you were utterly, whether it was after a life loss, the loss of somebody whose life you cherish, as much as you cherish your own, maybe even more. Or whether it was after a living loss. And living losses, I'm so glad you talked about the idea of coming up with a term 12 years ago. We started receiving phone calls. I started a foundation in my daughter's name, and as Marcy shared, and we started receiving phone calls from people who were saying, my child hasn't died, but every time the phone rings, I'm waiting to hear bad news. My son or my daughter is strung out. They've disappeared. Natalie Holloway, Beth Holloway's mom. Somebody was debilitated in an accident. Somebody was suddenly sick. They'd been diagnosed with something. Somebody was estranged. And all of these messages were living losses. But we didn't understand them as much. And part of what I'm going to talk to you about in the time we have is about the grief response that we experience in so many other areas, but because it's not a life loss, we really don't understand it. And it's a path for getting our hands around things. But how many of us know somebody who's gone through that? How many of us have ever in our own lives or in the lives of somebody we know and love stood in the middle of a moment where everything we had ever learned was rendered meaningless? We were in a moment of choiceless. I know that's a dangerous word to use in this room. Of choiceless pain. Where everything, somehow, everything in our lives didn't mean what it meant. Our lives as we knew them ended in a moment. That experience happened for me 16 years ago. The light of my life was my daughter, Jenna. I have 2 daughters, and I can tell you that I've never done anything better in this life than to be a father. I look out at Bobby. Bobby had both of my kids in super camp. Both of my daughters, my angel daughter and my earth daughter, the light of my life. So I received a phone call in the middle of the night telling me that my life as I knew it was over, and my daughter's life had ended in India while studying abroad about 40 minutes from the Taj Mahal. And what happens to us in that moment, and some of us, raise your hand if you suffered a traumatic loss, Some of us in this room know exactly that everything, every cell in our being turns inside out. And we fall to our knees and we begin this new life. And on this path that I've been on for the last 16 years, the threshold for what's true, because I had written books, I had been out around the world giving workshops, I'd been sharing knowledge, as we talked about. When knowledge is rendered useless, meaningless, and we're standing there in a pain. I remember Steve Wynn saying to me, he used to think before his daughter was kidnapped that pain went from 0 to 100. And now he knew it went to 0, from 0 to infinity. What do we do with that overwhelming amount of pain? How do we begin our lives? Now, how many of us know somebody who has transformed themselves and their lives? And how many of us? And think about yourself just for a moment, about the biggest loss you have ever experienced, something that was so utterly devastating. And it could have been a divorce, it could be a child, a parent's only as happy as their unhappiest child. We've all heard that. Whatever it is for you, the bottom of pain, what has that been for you? Your trip to the bottom of pain. And think about what you have done, who you were in that moment, and what you began to do. And that is what I've been living for the last 16 years. I've been immersed in that world. I knew it was the only formula for my own survival, was to immerse myself. And I started a foundation in my daughter's name. And 3 months after my own daughter had been killed, I was on a flight to New York to tell the people, one of my consulting clients, that I could no longer be the 7-day-a-week, on-call to you guy. It just wasn't going to happen. I was in trouble. No matter how constitutionally strong I was, I knew I was in trouble and I would have to pull back. And that's what I did. It just so happened that that was the night the TWA flight went into the water right off the coast of New York. And so suddenly I was at the Ramada Rincon Hotel talking to people, and a young mayor walked in. This is another story for another day, who was just simply walking up to tables. Well, that mayor was Rudy Giuliani. And I said, Mayor, can I come with you and help you be with these families? First thing you're going to need to do is tell them who you are. I'm Rudy Giuliani. I'm the mayor of New York. I'm so sorry for your loss, because he had no sense of how to be present. So for the last 16 years, I have been the go-to guy. Later, Mayor Giuliani would call me in after 9/11, and I stood in a room like this in front of 1,000 people. 1,000 people who just watched somebody they love be incinerated. And the first thing, and I had no idea because I don't know how to prepare speeches, I'm going to learn, but I walked into the room, and what do you say to 1,000 people who've got a glossy look in their eye? And the first thing I said was, how many of you feel more messed up than you ever imagined a human being could ever feel? Raise your hand, please. And every single hand went up. So the threshold for what we learn in deep grief is really the story that Miguel was sharing, that we've heard over and over again, that you share it so beautifully and eloquently, is what's real. And I've distilled the essence of everything I've learned from my own experience and from other families that go through this into a book called The Real Rules of Life. Not because I know what's real, but because there are lessons I've learned along the way. Let me share a few of them with you in the time we have. One of them is that paradox is the highest form of understanding loss, perhaps of understanding love. My daughter is gone. I held her body when it came back from India, and thankfully President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, who became friends, were helpful in that process. And I held my daughter's body, and she was no longer in that body. My daughter is gone, and yet from the moment of her death, she has been present. So I wear a chain around my neck with the Hebrew word Hineni. Hineni means I am here. My daughter is gone, and she's so present at times that the intimacy is almost overwhelming to me. She's so present. She is such a guide and a force in my life and a strength in my heart that it's almost indescribable. Another saying, another thing that we've learned along the way, to say that it's okay that it's not, it's okay that it's not okay. It's okay that it's not okay. It's not okay. Some things suck forever. I don't want to look at the glass as half full. I speak to bereaved parents all the time and families, and they'll tell you that people come up and we invoke, and what's the number one rule of talking to anybody in deep grief? We want to put a spin on it. We want to take their pain away. And who can blame us? We want to, if we can find a way to take our own pain away. But I will tell you that you can be absolutely right. The woman who came up to me and said, "Your daughter's in a better place," might be right. She could be absolutely right. And she was absolutely wrong for saying it to me at that moment. That was absolutely not what I needed to hear, or nor what I could hear. So how do we stand with one another? Because we are the laboratory here, and we go through this. And some of us walk into this room having just suffered a loss. Or we're sitting at lunch with a brother who receives a phone call of not such good news, of a living loss, or a living loss that might turn into a life loss. How do we stand with one another in that moment of grief and loss? And do we even know how to name it, what it is? I was surprised when I was with one of my consulting clients a couple of months ago, and everybody's sitting there. I'm sitting in a room with a company that's talking about how to serve its customers with a 1% return. This is an $8 billion financial services company, Wall Street firm. And what are they talking about? And I started writing, and I realized this is the grief response in Wall Street. You can't talk to your customer until you can listen. Compassion is your pain in my heart. I've got to stand with you in that moment of your loss. I can't hurry it. We're in a culture that wants to hide, deny, repress, hurry, avoid grief, and all the uncomfortableness around it. And sometimes we're too quick to run away from it. Sometimes I have the sense that we've lost our work ethic, our emotional honesty. Is the goal to be a slave or allegiant to our emotions or our grief, or to get stuck? No, that's not the goal. Is to somehow go through what we go through, to allow these emotions to be messengers to us, to speak to us of our love, of our sense of loss, of our true sense of loss. So these things are so critical. And when I look at what happens to people, all of us, I look at my own life. There's processed grief and there's unprocessed grief. Processed grief, whether it's through any of the techniques that we're learning here, any of the ways of being with one another, any of the ways of feeling into the spiritual unknowingness, the invoking of love, the clearing of space. That's the transformation with somehow processing that emotional side of grief. But what happens with unprocessed grief? It becomes indifference to the pain of others. It becomes a numbing. We have no faith in the fullness behind the emptiness. You know, we run from staring into the abyss, when staring into the abyss is one of the richest places we could harvest if we'd just but stay with it. But we're so quick in our culture to find a pill for every pain, a diversion for every emptiness, a fix for every problem. Our engineer mind wants to construct that way, when somehow allowing, sitting in that moment of allowing, is what we need. And it's not only an allowing of ourselves, it's an allowing with one another. It's the listening that Miguel talked about. It's that clear, pure, that clearing, that safe space that we all talk about, making this. You know, we talk about the aspiration of TLC. Isn't it always to make this space safer and safer and safer, and to feel our way into what that means, and how are we different? How do we take judgment? You know, great goal would be that a speaker comes up here and says, "You know what? I wasn't at all nervous Or if I was nervous, it was all me, because the safety of coming up and sharing everything, of getting naked with you. And by the way, I wasn't the guy who jumped off the bungee. But of becoming, presenting my work to you. People with such extraordinary analytic abilities and beautiful hearts and the vulnerability of that. But it's safe to do that. As a matter of fact, I'll get gifts back from doing that. It's like, hey, I want to share something with you that I think is an important piece of your work. So this journey that I've been on is not to get stuck in loss or to get stuck in suffering, but it's to create movement. It's to create movement towards love. It's to feel our way into a spiritual deepening, into the higher and better version of ourselves. And I'd like to believe that a lot of what's happened in my own life has been that journey. And I've been on the journey with some extraordinary people. Those of you who are in California know, and I was just sharing, know the situation of Chelsea King. A little girl disappears. We know about Natalie Holloway. And so I've been honored and privileged to be and to walk with families like this, families who have no skin on and are in that moment of utter pain. And what we underestimate, what we don't understand is that giving people a presence and a language, because traditionally, what do? We say, come in a couple of months. The shooting, we're getting calls already for Colorado. Come in a couple of months when people are ready, when they're through the shock. And the truth is that the language and the presence that we can create in the beginning of these tragedies is so critically helpful to people that the moment they need us at that moment of intervention is in that moment. As soon as we can, as soon as they are open to it. Even in their shock, because we know that the shock is going to wear off. We know reality is going to set in time, and we'll need to be there as well. But there's tremendous purpose in that. So, this is the world that I've been living in. It's a path. It's connecting for me in a transformational way into so many different other forms of expression. Maria Shriver wrote me that she loved this concept of living loss, and we just last week and the last couple of weeks we've been on her website with this concept of living losses, and we're getting overwhelmed with people saying, this gives me a handle on what I'm going through and how to begin to address it. So whatever it is, and we don't have time to talk about the kinds of processing that we've been doing, but whatever it is that you are doing, please take note that what people may be experiencing, ask yourself, what's been lost and what might be getting born out of this loss? Is this person dealing with some kind of a loss? And it could be something as subtle as that looking in the mirror and saying, my God, this guy that I remember, this identity I've been constructing, tied with my age, is no longer there. It's dying. I'm experiencing a loss. And how do I bless that loss? How do I understand the enormity of that that's part of the package deal? We don't necessarily sign up for, but that's part of the package deal. How do I embrace that, find some measure of peace in that, a little bit at a time, and go on and create something absolutely beautiful and extraordinary with the rest of the time that I do have? So I just leave you with the thought that one of the ways we make it safer is by becoming even more grief literate, more understanding of loss, of how loss plays and is interwoven in our lives. The last story I'll share is one of the greatest lessons of how this plays out on a global stage is I get a call from a man named Yitzhak Funkenthal. And Yitzhak's son was murdered by the Palestinians. He's an Israeli father. And he says, me and my Palestinian brother are coming to San Diego. And we believe we want to hook up with you guys. We believe there's work to do together. His Palestinian friend had his son killed. And these Israeli and Palestinian parents decided that the way to honor the losses of their children was to come together and create a conversation and a dialogue and a love and an understanding. And that's what they had done. And so they're one of our partner organizations. But how do we honor grief? And what happens? Is there a vicious cycle of unprocessed grief and violence that occurs when we don't process grief, when we don't honor grief, or find ways other than revenge and retribution? How about love? To connect with other people and make the world a safer place.
Thank you. Let's give Ken a huge gratitude for having moved our hearts so much. You really touched us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.